So let's start opening up some of these photos, shall we? So let's open up one of these guys.
Bloody hell. That's very different.
Yeah, if you notice, the roadway is blue.
Yes, it is.
On all of the shots. And what we were discussing is the fact that the red layer of the...
Look at the fogging too over here.
Yeah. Oh,
Yeah.
you can see that in the bitmaps. Everything just shows up in that. I think the red layer was highly affected.
This is the same thing that happened with the other ones. Remember, the blue was all over the map.
Yeah, it was. Yeah.
Yeah.
What level of vacuum was being used there?
That was -6. That's the one that was in Bill's chamber.
Yeah, but for only 4 hours.
Okay.
You see, that he should have left it in there for at least 72.
So there's the third one on this one.
They're very different, aren't they? Very different. God.
See, there's the blue again, right? Now look at, see there, the rocks
gravel,
are blue. Yeah. This is blue. Oh, by the way, this is, what do you call it? Fogged the hill here a little bit.
Yeah. Was it the same exposure you were using there?
Everything.
Everything the same. Okay.
Yeah. And these two went in the tank together as the same, right? They were all developed together.
Interesting. Very interesting. Because the exposure on the right-hand picture looks like it's slightly overexposed.
I have a light meter. I kept it right in the circle on all of these.
Okay.
Don't forget, though, I'm shooting the opposite direction.
You've got another one where you're shooting the same direction, though.
Yeah, so let's take one I'm shooting in on the same direction. That's exactly what I predicted would happen.
Yeah. Yeah. What was the level of vacuum on that? 10 to the -4?
6, but for only 4 hours.
Okay.
Like the red's gone here.
Yeah, it certainly affected it very badly, which you can see very clearly from those pictures. The very least you could say is the film is seriously damaged.
Okay, what about this? This will be interesting. How about, let's take a look at this shrub here.
Shit.
Yeah, that's almost the identical spot that you shot it at, right?
I mean, that's probably as good a demonstration as you need, because that then shows how different the left-hand picture is, because that's almost underexposed.
Yeah.
And it's showing some strange colors.
There is both. Okay, these are the Ektachrome 100, right? They went in the tank at the same time. They came out at the same time. They get hung up to dry at the same time.
Just imagine how good the picture would be if they were using the special film we're told they had, which they didn't. I think you proved your case there.
Yeah.
I think Bill's done a great job on that.
His film didn't do this. His film, the one that guy was using, it was more fogged than anything else. It's a different film, though, he's using.
Yep.
That's going to make a big difference, too.
Yep.
This is Ektachrome. This is Kodak Ektachrome 100.
That was the film used in the Hasselblad cameras on the lunar surface, we're told.
Yes,
Yeah,
if they were even able to take a picture on the lunar surface, they'd have serious problems with the quality, even with the special film.
The fact is that they're all screwed. This is all fogged over here. Yeah, it's funny how the control roll is so overexposed, isn't it?
Yeah.
But the colors are there. Like, the colors are proper, though.
Yeah, they are.
You know, they're like the browns are brown, greens are green, the rocks are the right color. Like it's all the proper colors. Like, these are all blue, and this is about the best one that came out on the vacuum one, though. But all over here, it's fogged. It's all fogged here.
Well, that's what you would expect to see on a film taken into a vacuum. But you don't see it on any Apollo photographs.
It's just colors just all over the map.
Yeah, yeah.
Let me share the screen for a minute, and I'll just show Marcus the comparison against the NASA photo. We'll just pull these two photographs up. I just pushed them up to 300%. So you take a NASA, one of their photographs, right? And that's what it looks like. You can see it's at 300%. And here's one of the ones that came out at 300%. And you can see the damage at 300%.
Yeah, you can.
That's happening all the way through here. Doesn't matter where you go. That's at 300%.
Yeah. Very distinct damage.
And that's when you start to see what's happening with the emulsion inside. It doesn't matter where you go in there.
It's been affected quite badly.
Look at this. Just disgusting, eh?
Yeah.
It's not even throughout the photograph either. When you come here, you can just see it. It's just starting to get just a little blurry at 300%. But everything is there.
Yeah.
The reticule's still perfect. It doesn't have any distortion around it whatsoever at 300%. So that's a NASA photograph against something that actually went into a vacuum chamber. Well, this one claimed that they were in a much greater vacuum for a much longer time, and this is one that was only 10 to the -6 for 4 hours without radiation, without temperature variances or anything else. That's what people need to see.
That's a good point.
Because that's the comparison to what NASA claims that they did, their quality of photographs.
Let's put the challenge out there, shall we? That anybody who disputes what we're saying, anybody who disputes that we have done this correctly, then do it yourself. Get a vacuum chamber, get the film that we used, and find out that it doesn't work.
Well, you can physically see it off gas in Bill's videos, which we can present.
Well, of course it'll outgas. I mean, that's the whole point of a vacuum. That's what it does. And he was saying, wasn't he, that there was a lot of residue inside the chamber after he'd used it.
When Robert did the testing, it actually blocked his filters up.
So where's that residue coming from? Come on, you guys, if you're disputing what we're saying, answer that question as a start and do your own test to prove that we're wrong. We're not wrong. Your criticism of us is wrong because you're desperate to support the Apollo narrative, which is now falling apart. Well, it has fallen apart. So we can demonstrate quite clearly.
I think the viewers need to have some more content other than the fact of what we have discovered and what we have done so far. And there's a lot of people that were not around during that time period. There's a lot of people that are new to the subject and they don't have any previous experience on it. So I think what we should do is we should look through the past history of the people who claim that the moon landing was a hoax. And the best site to do that is the ALICE site. And you've chosen a particular topic here with Phil Coots. I think first you should go over the creation of this particular website with Mary Bennett and David Percy.
The ALICE website, ALICE online here, different thinking, and there are subjects covered there, the Apollo moon, space flight, and then news and the other various subjects. There are so many articles on there, and once you start reading them, this website was established by David Percy and Mary Bennett at the time they published their definitive book on the subject, Dark Moon, and that was in 1999. They followed it up with their film, What Happened on the Moon, which is basically a long-term interview about the subjects covered in Dark Moon. It was conducted in the form of an investigation, and it's quite a lengthy film, but it's worth following through because it gives you some of the very best information about the Apollo hoax. Now, when David Percy set this up, he's a photographer and a filmmaker himself, so he knows about cameras, he knows about film, he knows what they can and cannot record. Mary Bennett is a very good writer, and she did the editing and writing of the book, Dark Moon. Though it was published nearly 25 years ago, it is the definitive book on the subject. You need to read that book in conjunction with the ALICE website, this website, because following the publication of the book, a lot of people contacted David through the website and said, look, there's information here which I think you might be interested in. And that's where the website started. He published the articles that people sent in. They come from all over the world, these articles, from Russia, from New Zealand, from Australia, from America. They're people who've started to examine the Apollo record in detail. And that's really only been possible since the advent of the internet in its present form, where you can get high definition images downloaded in a matter of seconds. Prior to the mid-90s, that wasn't possible. And prior to the mid-1990s, NASA had not published their full catalogue of photographs. So nobody could actually examine them. The first time anybody could really examine all the Apollo photographs was following NASA's decision to put them all online. People then started to examine them and wrote articles, examinations, and David was able to publish the good ones. They're all edited very well. Mary Bennett is a very good writer, and she helps with the editing of the articles. And there are so many of them, it'll probably take you several weeks to go through the full list, let alone the photo analysis conducted by Jack White, who is a professional photo analyst. He's recently died, but his work lives on the OWLIS website. There's a special section for the Jack White analysis. Here we go, Jack White's Apollo Studies. That's something to look at, because Jack has identified many quite serious anomalies in the photographs. And because he knows what he's looking for, he can identify them in the photographs that NASA has put online. And just as an aside, I was being interviewed on Coast to Coast AM about 25 years ago. Jack was obviously listening to the discussion on Coast to Coast and contacted me and said, I've got some information that might be of interest to you. And he sent me a few photographs that he had examined. And I said, that is fantastic work. I passed them on to David Percy. David and Jack got in touch, and that's where Jack's lifetime's work into Apollo is now available on the OWLIS website. Certainly worth looking at, because he's identified many problems with the photographs. And we'll come to it in a bit, what those problems are likely to have been. Some of Jack's work is definitely worth looking into. Now, the other point you mentioned earlier, one of the authors on the website is Phil Coots, who lives in New Zealand. And he has examined it from a scientific point of view. He's examined the Apollo record from a scientific point of view. And he's published, there are 5 articles on the website from Phil Coots. This is just one of them, Apollo through the prism of critical thinking. And that is an important point. You have to apply critical thinking to this, analytical thinking. If this happened, how did that happen? If that happened, why did that happen? If something is not right, it doesn't make logical sense, then one can question it. And that's all that Phil Coots, Jack White, and all the other authors on the website have done. Jarrah White being another one who's contributing his own personal articles. He's got 6 so far. Jarrah is one of the major proponents of the Apollo hoax and has published a lot of information, a lot of YouTube films about it on his own website, and he's now contributing to the OWLIS website as well. Jarrah White's website is moonfaker.com. So you know where he's coming from. Certainly we're checking those out as well. Now what Phil Coots did, he asked a very simple question. Should humans be landing on the moon and not returning to build a moon base? 3 of his articles, which were published in NEXUS Magazine, ask that question. What now for a moon base? And there are various other points that Phil Coots has made, which stand up to a lot of scrutiny, because Phil has just gone to the official NASA records, examined them, dissected them, and come to conclusions that the Apollo missions could not have happened, could not possibly have happened, to the extent that no human has been further from Earth than low Earth orbit, which is the furthest human has been is 400 miles on the repairing of the Hubble Space Telescope. Now, one of the points that Phil makes is the Saturn V rocket, that whacking great rocket we all saw take off and disappear out of sight about 2 minutes after it took off. Was it powerful enough to do the job it was supposed to do? This is critical thinking. This is examining, saying, well, NASA says that the Saturn V rocket was carrying 125 tons, 130 tons into low Earth orbit. Well, you can calculate how fast it has to be going to carry that amount of weight into low Earth orbit. And it wasn't going fast enough. So what was the problem? Was it that the engines were not as powerful as we were told they were? We were told there were 5 F1 engines on the Saturn V rocket, each of which was producing 1.5 million pounds of thrust. So you can calculate the weight that it would be required to lift with that amount of power. Did it get into low Earth orbit? Or did the Saturn V rocket just fall down into the Atlantic after it had gone out of human sight from Cape Canaveral or Cape Kennedy and is in the bottom of the ocean? Ah, I hear somebody say, but Jeff Bezos has recovered one of those engines from the Atlantic Ocean. Yes, he has. It's on display in Seattle. But he doesn't tell us where he recovered it from, where exactly he recovered it from, because you can calculate if a rocket is going to go to the moon, it has to achieve a certain speed at a certain point in its flight. And if it's not going fast enough, it's not going to get to the moon. The Saturn V rocket appears to be not going fast enough to get to the moon. The calculations can be done, and the calculations have been done to demonstrate that it was false information, i.e. fake news. Now that picture there we're seeing from Popular Mechanics, the next giant leap, and it shows the Apollo lunar lander, presumably.
That's the 1966 photograph or sketch.
That's right.
Repeated in 2019.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, that's a good point. Repeated in 2019. But what it shows is the Saturn V rocket engine, assuming it was on the moon, would have moved the dirt on the lunar surface into striations, which would be obviously visible. This was a painting by Norman Rockwell, who was very particular about getting everything accurate. And he consulted NASA people to say, well, what would it look like on the moon? And they told him. But if you look at the later alleged real photographs of the Apollo lander on the lunar surface, there's no such information about striations caused by the rocket. There's a problem with that. If the F1 engines were not as powerful as we're told they were, it couldn't have lifted the rocket to the required height, carrying the weight we're told it carried. Because if it was as powerful as it is claimed to be, why weren't those same engines then used on the space shuttle, which was a smaller load to get into orbit, and it only had to go into Earth orbit, but they didn't use the Saturn V rocket engines, the F1 engines, again. They were never used again. And as Phil Coots made very clear, they're not even mentioned in the latest reports from the GOA, General Accounting Office, to power any of the new rockets. The SLS is not powered by the Saturn F1 engine, which it should be. It's powered by space shuttle engines, which are much less powerful. Anyway, the Apollo 11 Saturn V seriously underpowered. So people have been looking at this more recent information for 10 years now. The Aulis site has been in existence for 25 years. So there's a collection of articles there which is so necessary to read, understand, and think about critically. One of the other points made, which I think is very relevant, is if you look at any photograph of an Apollo command module, which is the only part of the rocket that ever returned to Earth, we're told, you'll see on it handles, which were obviously then used by astronauts to do their EVAs, to make sure that they could grip onto something. The handles were made of aluminium, and they were constantly being told how hot it is when you return from space in the command module. Aluminium melts at 600 degrees centigrade. The temperatures generated are in excess of 3,000 degrees centigrade. So how are the aluminium handles still in existence on the command modules when they return to Earth? On display in the Air and Space Museum for Apollo 11, the London Science Museum for Apollo 10, They've all got the handles on them. So that's a question which has been asked and not been adequately answered. In the filming of many of the Apollo missions, were mannequins used on stage sets, were models used of the lunar lander. This would appear to be the case, given that many of the photographs, which if you examine them closely, you'll see that the astronaut in the photograph is quite often in an identical position between 2 or 3 different photographs. That wouldn't happen if you were photographing a real human moving around. You wouldn't get stationary astronaut, the famous Grand Prix on the lunar surface. What a stupid thing to do. Gun your car so it'll go at about 15 kilometers an hour, or whatever the top speed was. And we're told that this was just so that they could practice going fast. What's going on? How did they know they weren't going to hit a rock? There are plenty of rocks around. There's no GPS back in those days. If they'd hit a rock and injured themselves, damaged the vehicle, there was no rescue. There's no vehicle rescue service. There's no human rescue service. They should have been behaving in a sensible, controlled manner, not in a schoolboy jumping around fashion. The Apollo 11 press conference is one of the most depressing pieces of film you'll see. These are 3 men, Armstrong, Aldrin, and Collins, who had allegedly, or 2 of them had allegedly walked on the lunar surface. They looked like they were scared of something. They looked like they were under a lot of pressure. They weren't answering questions particularly well. But when they were asked if they could see stars from the lunar surface by Patrick Moore, a UK-based astronomer who's now died, but he asked the question that everybody remembers, could you see stars through the solar corona? And they said, no, you couldn't. Why not? Of course you could see stars anywhere. All you've got to do is to look up from the lunar surface, assuming you were there, and you would see stars. You would see a canopy of stars that would be so overwhelmingly beautiful that you would mention it when you got back to Earth. You would say, I saw the stars unimpeded by Earth's atmosphere. It was like a canopy of stars, a canopy of light in the sky above us. But they didn't talk about it. They didn't mention it. So it's, again, an anomaly in the Apollo record.
Well, they were so depressed that's why in Apollo 12 they had to put the EO on the cue card, enthusiastic observations.
I like that, yes, they
Right?
did.
Also on Apollo 16, when you were mentioning the Grand Prix, that is in the cue cards as well. The camera positions in the cue cards, and it shows them how to go around the little craters is already diagrammed there. I don't know how they knew they were going to land so that those craters would be in those positions.
Yeah, especially from the viewpoint of the camera.
I mean, it's so well staged and rehearsed and everything else. But when you look at the cue cards, how do you know what the material, what the different rock formations are on something that's about the size of a football, and you crack it open and you're going to say what rock formation is in there and what kind of minerals are in that rock? And that's all described in the cue cards. And I don't know of anybody that knows what the mineral content is of a rock before you split it open, if you've never seen it before. Right? And it certainly isn't a large enough rock that they could have viewed by any of their claimed remote or camera or tracking or anything else. But the Grand Prix itself, those little craters that they go around, loop back and forth, and the camera position, and so you take the camera position, the sequence of 4 little craters in relationship to the LEM where it's sitting is all in the cue cards. That's impossible to land in that spot, number one. You only have to be 1/10 of a second off at launch and you're not going to be anywhere near it.
Exactly. An excellent point.
That's what they rehearsed with.
Yes. I mean, that's basically what the cue cards were. They were a mobile script for what they
for them to practice with. And then to repeat that exactly in a remote location is absolutely impossible.
Yeah.
But that's exactly what they did.
This is the point about critical thinking. It's necessary to ask these questions. They're quite legitimate questions. There's nothing conspiratorial about it. It's using the basic information that NASA have provided to the world by posting it all on their website and asking questions about it. How did they know that the craters were there? How did they know where the camera position should be in relation to the LEM? Right, you can work that out, but you don't know what the ground is going to be like because the photographs you're working from are nowhere near as detailed as you would need to be able to provide that information on the cue cards. It's just a straightforward question.
And not to mention the fact that they've got 3 camera positions. One guy's on the rover, so that means that one guy is operating 3 different cameras at the same time. TV cameras, plus taking photographs at the same time.
It's wonderful, isn't it?
Yeah.
Definitely got the right stuff.
What people really need to understand fully is the fact that the ALLA site has been there for what? Going on 30 years now, right?
Yeah. 25, 30 years.
And there are just literally hundreds of articles. There's links to every resource that you could possibly think about within that. The publications, the book publications, the movie publications. David has been very, very careful as to only use accredited people that he researches himself to. He's not going to publish anything that does not have any credibility or somebody that has absolutely no what we're saying, with the exception of myself. He allowed me to publish a couple of photographs, right? I can't put a PhD behind the thing. I just simply see what's there. If it's a wet flag, it's a wet flag. You know, if Buzz Aldrin's, up against the door frame when there's supposed to be a console there, just little things like that. If there's a beer can in the way or a car laying on the ground that they just shotcreted over, those things are there. If people want to look further at the photographs, I mean, Jack White, when you consider the fact that the time he was working at, the incredible amount of time it would take to even access the photographs and download them. Yeah. Even when I started, it took a long time to download each photograph. It's not like you just snap your finger and they come down like they are today. You could download an entire magazine in the same time it would take me to bring 2 or 3 down, right? Jack was taking even longer than that. He was working on probably a 600 by 800 CRT monitor, and the software wasn't as capable as we have today to work with. And he still came up with all of those findings, which is absolutely incredible. I mean, that's real study.
Yeah, it is. He's done remarkable work, and nobody, to my knowledge, has disputed anything that Jack has said. And he's published about 200 images. They're all on the Owless website.
The work that Jack White did, there's one photo that he had a look at, and it was the one with the astronaut with the 16 millimeter cine camera in the visor. Yeah. And when you look at the one on Owless and you look at the one that we did about 4 years ago, and then you look at the one that they're showing now on March to the Moon, that cine camera's lens is gone. They've been tampering with that because on Jack White's, on Owless, you can see the actual lens and you can see the focus ring and you can see the aperture ring on there. You cannot see that in ours, or you can't find it any longer on March to the Moon or the Apollo Lunar Surface Journal. I had a look and it's gone. So they've been tampering with it.
Oh, they
have. That's the same as you take a look at the wet flag when it's being posted now, right? They just made it really dark blue in some of them.
Yeah.
When they advertise it, or actually they put it into, say, Photoshop and they turn it into a painting instead, right?
Now, Phil Coots, one should explain, is a pseudonym. He does have a PhD, but because he was not prepared to tolerate the criticism he would receive as a professional scientist working today, he used a pseudonym, which I think is quite sensible. And that's why nobody can find him. So what you've got there is basically the image as NASA predicted it would be, but not as it actually was. Oh, here's the famous footprint on the lunar surface.
This is the one from a movie that was made that was sitting here. Yeah. And of course, they're showing it As they pull back, there's no LEM, there's no other footprints, there's only the single footprint.
It's a very strange viewpoint, that. It's quite misleading. National Geographic appears to have produced it.
This was Back to the Moon 2019, broadcast in New Zealand. Here's Phil talking about the historical aspects and parallels, right?
Apollo is generally recognized as a unique achievement, a major advance in the realm of research and development in multiple areas over a relatively short time period, especially considering that in May 1961, when President Kennedy announced his goal of going to the moon, there was just one orbital flight completed by a Soviet cosmonaut, only one suborbital flight by an American astronaut. Nevertheless, in December 1968, NASA and the US government announced the first flight around the moon and safe return of the crew back to Earth, Apollo 8. Then, within the next 4 years, NASA had declared completion of 6 successful landings. Surprisingly, however, no progress in human space exploration beyond low Earth orbit over the following 50 years, as ECHO has evolved from this seemingly successful success. Why so?
Here's this little line here. Metal alloys, some of which have not yet been invented. And the next year, they're landing on the moon. I mean, in 1968, you haven't even developed the materials.
Now, that comment was made by John Kennedy at Rice University in September 1962. The alloys not yet invented.
Yeah, and that's in particular discussing back to the F1 engines again, the chamber nozzle.
And that's the point that Randy Walsh has picked up on and examined very closely in his books, that the alloys appeared not to work, which was probably one of the difficulties experienced during Apollo 6, where there was the pogo effect, which was pre-ignition in effect, in the combustion chamber. And a few months later, they were flying to the moon with Apollo 8. That obviously solved the problem, but they never told us how they solved it. They knew there was a problem. So again, a logical thought would be, well, how did they solve it? Explain the science behind it. Don't just say you solved it. Explain how you solved it. And this is a thing that NASA always seemed to omit. It's one of the steps of the scientific investigation. You have to explain what is going on. If you claim to have solved the problem of the alloy in the engines, how did they overcome the considerably higher temperature in the engine, in the F1 engines? How did they overcome the problem with the heat to ensure the integrity of the engine, that it would deliver the power that was required and we're told existed? How did they do that?
I think what people are going to find out when they start looking at the ALICE site and reading these articles is every time that they're reading through and these are questions on there, they're going to end up having even more questions.